I'll never forget the morning of May 10, 1945, when I entered a bombed-out basement in Berlin's Charlottenburg district, expecting to find German soldiers hiding, and instead discovered 23 children, the youngest barely 3 years old, huddled together without parents, without food and without hope, their eyes reflecting the same terror I'd seen in Russian children during the German invasion. The spring sun was trying to break through the smoke still rising from Berlin's ruins, the smell of death and destruction mixing with the sweet scent of lilacs, somehow still blooming. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear Soviet soldiers singing victory songs while these German children waited silently to learn their fate. I was Captain Dmitry Red Cross Volkov, Medical Corps, Red Army, and after 4 years of war from Stalingrad to Berlin, I thought I understood everything about hatred, about the justified rage that had driven us across half of Europe to destroy the nation that had nearly destroyed ours, and about the moral clarity that came from fighting against an enemy who had committed unspeakable atrocities against Soviet civilians. I'd earned my nickname Red Cross, not from gentleness, but from my dedication to saving Soviet soldiers so they could return to combat and kill more Germans, had treated thousands of casualties from battles where German forces showed no mercy, and genuinely believed that Germany deserved whatever suffering the Red Army inflicted upon it. But what I witnessed during those 6 months in conquered Berlin would challenge everything I'd believed about collective guilt, about whether children bore responsibility for their father's crimes, and about the difference between justice and revenge. Those German children would teach me that medical ethics transcended politics and nationality, that innocence existed even among enemy populations, and that sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought with weapons, but with the choice to heal rather than to harm. My journey to that basement full of terrified children began on January 12, 1945, when the Red Army launched the Vistula Oder offensive that would carry us from Poland to the gates of Berlin in less than 2 months. I'd been serving as a frontline medical officer since 1941, treating casualties from every major battle on the Eastern Front, and I'd seen what German forces did to Soviet territory during their invasion and occupation. "Comrades," announced Major General Ivan Petrov during our final briefing before the Berlin assault, "we are about to enter the fascist beast's lair and deliver the killing blow that will end this war." Remember what the Germans did to our homeland. The burned villages, the murdered civilians, the children starved and frozen. Berlin will pay for Soviet suffering. His words captured the rage that motivated every Soviet soldier as we approached Berlin. We weren't just fighting to defeat Germany militarily. We were fighting for vengeance against a nation that had invaded our homeland, killed 20 million Soviet citizens, and committed atrocities that defied comprehension. "Comrade Captain," said my medical assistant, Junior Lieutenant Alexei Sokolov, "when we reach Berlin, will you continue treating German wounded, or will you let fascists die as they deserve?" His question reflected the moral dilemma facing Soviet medical personnel. Our duty was to treat all wounded, according to medical ethics and Geneva Convention requirements. But our humanity demanded revenge for what Germans had done to our people and our nation. "I will treat Soviet soldiers first, second and always," I replied. "If German wounded require medical attention, and we have capacity after treating our own, then medical ethics require we provide care. But I will not waste Soviet medical supplies on fascists while Soviet soldiers wait for treatment." This position seemed to balance medical ethics with practical reality and Soviet priorities. But it would prove inadequate when confronted with the human cost of total war and the reality that some victims bore no responsibility for the crimes committed in their nation's name. The Battle of Berlin began on April 16, 1945, and lasted until May 2nd, when German forces finally surrendered. Those 17 days involved some of the most intense urban combat of the entire war, with Soviet forces fighting block by block through a city that Hitler had ordered defended to the last bullet. My medical unit followed close behind assault forces, establishing aid stations in captured buildings and treating the continuous stream of casualties that urban warfare produced. Soviet losses were heavy. We were attacking fortified positions held by desperate defenders who knew that defeat meant the end of their regime and possibly their nation. But German military casualties were accompanied by enormous civilian casualties, as artillery fire, bombing and street fighting destroyed buildings where German civilians sheltered. Berlin's population in April 1945 was approximately 2.5 million, mostly women, children and elderly men, since most military-age males were either dead, fighting, or already captured. "Comrade Captain," reported Alexei after we'd established an aid station in what had been a German hospital, "there are German civilians seeking medical treatment. Many are children with injuries from bombing and artillery fire. What are your orders?" My initial instinct was to refuse. Soviet medical resources should serve Soviet personnel, not the enemy civilians who'd supported the regime that invaded our homeland. But the children he described weren't soldiers or Nazi officials. They were innocents caught in combat that they hadn't chosen and couldn't escape. "Treat life-threatening injuries in children," I ordered. "But German adults must wait until all Soviet casualties have been treated. We have limited supplies and must prioritize accordingly." This compromise satisfied immediate practical requirements while acknowledging that children deserved medical attention regardless of their nationality. But it didn't prepare me for the scale of civilian suffering we'd encounter as Soviet forces completed Berlin's conquest. The moment that would transform my understanding of my duties and my moral responsibilities came on May 10th, 8 days after Berlin's surrender, when I was searching damaged buildings for Soviet wounded who might have been missed during initial casualty collection operations. The basement I entered in Charlottenburg had been used as a shelter during the final days of fighting. Bodies of dead German soldiers and civilians lay in the entrance, suggesting this had been a defensive position that was overrun during street fighting. "Is anyone alive here?" I called in German, having learned enough of the language during 4 years of war to conduct basic communication. "This is Soviet medical officer. If you are wounded, show yourself." The response came not from wounded soldiers, but from children's voices, weak, frightened, speaking in German that I could barely understand through their dialect and fear. "Bitte, helfen Sie uns," called a girl's voice. "Please help us. We are children. We are hungry." What I found in that basement would haunt me for the rest of my life and force me to confront questions about collective responsibility, individual innocence, and whether children could be considered enemies regardless of what their fathers had done. 23 children, ranging in age from approximately 3 to 14 years old, huddled together in the darkness of that basement. They were filthy, malnourished, and terrified, abandoned by parents who were dead, fled, or missing in the chaos of Berlin's collapse. The oldest, a girl of perhaps 14 named Greta, spoke for the group in broken sentences that revealed their desperate situation. "Our parents are gone. Some died in bombing, some fled, some we don't know where they are. We have been here for 5 days without food. My little sister is sick. Please don't hurt us." Her plea, "Please don't hurt us," revealed what these German children expected from Soviet soldiers. They'd been taught that Soviet forces were barbaric Asiatic hordes who murdered civilians without mercy, and now they were at our mercy with no protection and no hope. "I am doctor," I said in my broken German. "I will not hurt children. I will help you." But even as I said those words, I felt conflict between medical duty and personal hatred for what Germans had done to Soviet children. Why should I help German children when German soldiers had murdered Soviet children deliberately and systematically? The answer came when I examined the youngest child, a girl of perhaps 3 who was burning with fever and clearly suffering from infection that would kill her without medical treatment. She looked at me with eyes that held no hatred, no understanding of war or politics, no responsibility for Nazi crimes, just fear and pain, and the desperate hope that this stranger might ease her suffering. "Alexei," I called to my assistant, "bring medical supplies. We have children here who need treatment." My decision to treat these German children wasn't based on forgiveness or political reconciliation. It was based on medical ethics that transcended nationality and on recognition that children bore no responsibility for their father's crimes. But treating 23 children in a basement was only the beginning of what I would discover about Berlin's child casualties and the medical crisis facing the city's youngest survivors. Over the following days, as I reported the children's situation to Soviet authorities and arranged their transfer to temporary shelter, I learned that thousands of German children had been orphaned or separated from families during Berlin's conquest. Many were injured, all were malnourished, and most lacked any adult protection in a city where normal civil authority had completely collapsed. "Comrade Captain," said Colonel Boris Kuznetsov, the Soviet military commandant for our district, "your report about orphaned children has been noted, but this is German problem. Let Germans handle their own children once they establish civilian administration." His response reflected official Soviet policy that Germans should take responsibility for rebuilding their shattered nation. But civilian administration was barely functioning. German medical facilities had been destroyed, and children were dying while bureaucrats debated responsibility. "Comrade Colonel," I argued, "children are dying from treatable conditions while we debate politics. As a physician and a Soviet officer, I request permission to organize medical services for Berlin's orphaned children using captured German medical supplies and facilities." Kuznetsov's response revealed both the practical realities facing Soviet occupation forces and an unexpected willingness to allow humanitarian initiatives that went beyond strict military requirements. "Comrade Captain, if you wish to spend your time treating German children using German resources, I will not forbid it, but you will receive no official support, no Soviet medical supplies, and no recognition for this work." "You are due to rotate home to the Soviet Union in June. If you choose to remain in Berlin healing Germans instead, that is your decision." His permission was grudging but genuine, creating an opportunity for me to follow medical ethics even when they contradicted political expedience and personal desires for revenge. The establishment of Berlin's first post-war children's hospital began on May 15, 1945, when I requisitioned a damaged but repairable building that had housed a German military clinic. Using captured medical supplies, surviving German medical equipment, and volunteer assistance from German nurses and doctors who'd survived Berlin's conquest, we created a facility that could treat sick and injured children regardless of their nationality or background. "Comrade Captain," asked Alexei, who'd volunteered to assist despite his own mixed feelings about helping Germans, "why are we doing this? These German children's fathers killed Soviet children. Why should we save them when their people showed no mercy to ours?" His question captured the moral dilemma I wrestled with every day. Why should I dedicate my medical skills to healing the children of enemies who'd tried to exterminate my people? The answer became clear through my daily interactions with the children we were treating. These weren't Nazi soldiers or regime supporters. They were innocents who'd been victimized by the same war that had victimized Soviet children, who'd lost parents and homes and security through no fault of their own, who deserved medical care because they were human beings in need regardless of what crimes their nation had committed. Alexei, I replied, we are doing this because these children are not responsible for German crimes, because medical ethics require us to treat those who need help, and because Soviet victory should demonstrate that we are better than the fascists we defeated. Over the following months, the Children's Hospital grew from a small clinic treating dozens of patients to a comprehensive facility serving hundreds of children from across Soviet-occupied Berlin. We treated injuries from bombing and combat, infectious diseases from unsanitary conditions, malnutrition from months of inadequate food, and psychological trauma from experiences no child should endure. Dr. Volkov, said Nurse Helga Schmidt, a German civilian who'd volunteered to work in the hospital, the children call you der gute Russe, the good Russian. They trust you because you treat them with kindness and respect, unlike what Nazi propaganda told them to expect from Soviet soldiers. Her observation revealed how medical care was challenging German children's propaganda-induced fears about Soviet forces. We weren't the barbaric monsters they'd been taught to fear. We were medical professionals providing healing and comfort during their darkest time. But the most profound transformation occurred not in the German children we treated, but in my own understanding of collective responsibility and individual innocence. Working daily with children who'd lost everything forced me to recognize that political crimes didn't justify punishing innocent descendants, that medical ethics transcended national boundaries, and that healing was more important than revenge. Comrade Captain, wrote my wife Nina in a letter that reached me in July, your mother asks when you will come home. The war is over, Germany is defeated, and your duty is fulfilled. Why do you remain in Berlin treating German children when Soviet children need their father to return? Her question was fair and painful. I'd been away from my family for 4 years. My children were growing up without their father, and I was choosing to remain in Germany treating enemy children rather than returning home to my own family. But I'd also made commitments to German children who depended on the hospital we'd created, who would suffer if I abandoned them before establishing sustainable medical services, who deserved continuity of care, regardless of my personal desires to reunite with my family. Nina, I wrote back, I will come home when I have fulfilled my medical duty here. These German children are not our enemies. They are victims of the same war that victimized our children. As a physician, I cannot abandon them while they still need medical care. My decision to remain in Berlin beyond my scheduled rotation reflected not political ideology, but professional ethics and personal conscience. I couldn't return home in good conscience while children died from treatable conditions in the hospital I'd helped establish. The validation of my decision came through the children we saved and the German medical professionals who learned that not all Soviet soldiers were motivated by revenge. We treated over 2,000 children between May and November 1945, saving hundreds who would have died without medical intervention. Dr. Volkov, said Dr. Friedrich Weber, a German pediatrician who joined our hospital staff, you have shown German people that Soviet medical personnel uphold professional ethics even toward former enemies. This will be remembered when Germans think about Soviet occupation and Soviet character. His words suggested that medical care was achieving what propaganda couldn't, demonstrating Soviet humanity to Germans who'd been taught to see us as monsters. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from the children themselves, who gradually recovered physical health and psychological security through consistent medical care and adult kindness that helped them begin healing from trauma. Herr Doctor, said young Greta, the 14-year-old who'd spoken for the children in that basement, thank you for saving my sister and for showing us that not all Russians are what we were taught to fear. You gave us hope when we had none. Her gratitude was genuine and painful. Painful because it reminded me of Soviet children who'd received no such mercy from German forces, who died from deliberate starvation and murder rather than from collateral damage of combat operations. My time in Berlin ended on November 15, 1945, when I finally rotated home to the Soviet Union after establishing sustainable medical services for Berlin's orphaned and injured children. German civilian authorities had begun functioning adequately. German medical professionals had resumed normal duties, and the hospital we'd created could continue operations without Soviet military support. Comrade Captain, said Colonel Kuznetsov during my departure briefing, your work with German children was noted by higher authorities. Some questioned why you spent 6 months healing Germans instead of returning home to your family. But others recognized that your medical service demonstrated Soviet superiority over fascist barbarism more effectively than any propaganda could achieve. His words suggested that my humanitarian work had served Soviet interests, even though that hadn't been my primary motivation. I'd treated German children because medical ethics required it, because they needed help, and because I couldn't reconcile my professional responsibilities with abandoning children who depended on medical care I could provide. The journey home to the Soviet Union took 2 weeks, giving me time to process what I'd learned during 6 months of treating former enemy children and to prepare for reunion with my own family, whom I hadn't seen since 1941. "Papa!" cried my children when I finally walked into our apartment in Moscow on December the 1st, 1945. They'd been 5 and 7 when I left for the front. Now they were 9 and 11, having grown up during my 4 years away at war. "I'm home," I said, holding them close and weeping with relief that I'd survived to see them again. "The war is over, and I'm finally home." My wife Nina held me afterward, asking the question that had haunted her since my letters from Berlin explained why I'd delayed coming home. "Dmitri, did you really need to stay in Berlin for 6 months, treating German children? Couldn't German doctors have done that work while you came home to your own children?" Her question was fair and required honest answer. "Nina, I stayed because those German children needed medical care that no one else was providing, because medical ethics required me." To help patients in need regardless of nationality, and because I couldn't abandon children who depended on me just to satisfy my own desires to come home. I paused, formulating thoughts that had developed over 6 months of treating former enemy children. I went to Berlin expecting to feel satisfaction at German suffering and defeat. Instead, I found children who'd lost everything and who needed help that only I could provide. Healing them didn't erase German crimes or Soviet suffering, but it proved that Soviet medical personnel would uphold professional ethics even toward enemies. My post-war career continued in military medicine, but the experience of treating German children in Berlin influenced everything I did subsequently. I became an advocate for medical ethics that transcended politics, for treating all patients with equal dedication regardless of their background, and for recognizing that children were always innocent victims of adult conflicts. "Students," I would tell each new class of military medical officers, "you will face situations where political ideology conflicts with medical ethics, where hatred tempts you to withhold treatment from enemies, where revenge seems more satisfying than healing. But remember that medicine serves humanity, not politics, and that children are always innocent, regardless of what their parents did." This was my story, Captain Dmitry Red Cross Volkov, who came to Berlin seeking military victory and found medical duty that transcended politics, who discovered that healing enemy children was harder than hating them, but more important for my own humanity, and who learned that medical ethics required treating all patients with equal dedication, regardless of whether they were compatriots or former enemies. My experience in Berlin taught me that collective guilt was a political concept, but individual innocence was a medical reality, that children bore no responsibility for their parents' crimes, and that sometimes the most important victories were achieved not through weapons but through choosing to heal rather than to harm. What struck you most about a Soviet doctor choosing to stay in Berlin treating German children? Have you heard similar stories about medical professionals whose ethics transcended political conflicts? These personal testimonies help us understand how individual conscience can challenge hatred and create healing. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories live on.